Tonight we unlock the vault that holds the Vatican's most dangerous secret. Not ancient manuscripts or theological mysteries, but something far more explosive in the modern world: money. $2 billion of it, to be exact. Hidden within the marble halls of Vatican City lies a financial crisis so catastrophic it could bring down the world's oldest institution before the decade ends. For over 70 years, the Catholic Church has been operating what financial experts are calling the largest Ponzi scheme in religious history. While cardinals preach about poverty and sacrifice, they've been systematically looting a pension fund designed to care for retired priests, nuns, and Vatican employees. Money that should have secured the golden years of those who devoted their lives to the Church has instead funded lavish renovations, suspicious investments, and offshore accounts that read like a money laundering operation. But here's what makes this scandal different from every other Vatican financial controversy. This time, they can't pray their way out of it. The mathematics are brutal and undeniable. The pension fund is hemorrhaging money faster than Sunday collections can replenish it. Actuarial reports buried in Vatican archives show the system will collapse completely by 2030, leaving thousands of elderly clergy destitute and exposing the Church to lawsuits that could bankrupt even their vast real estate holdings. This isn't about theological disputes or moral failings. This is about cold, hard numbers that don't care about papal infallibility or divine providence. The Vatican has been robbing Peter to pay Paul for so long that they've forgotten which saint protects them from financial ruin. And the clock is ticking louder than the bells of St. Peter's Basilica. Like this video. Subscribe, because tonight we're following the money trail that leads to the darkest corners of Vatican finance, where pension promises turned into pension theft, and where the Church's moral authority is about to collide with mathematical reality in the most devastating way possible. Part 1. The accountant who knew MUCH father, Antonio Guerrieri, had always been good with numbers. Too good, as it turned out. After 28 years managing finances for various Vatican departments, he thought he'd seen every creative accounting method the Church employed to stretch its resources. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the basement. Archives of the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See on a rainy Tuesday morning in October 2023. The file was mislabeled, tucked behind decades of routine financial reports in a section that smelled of dust and forgotten bureaucracy. Clergy Retirement Supplemental Confidential Analysis 1995 to 2023. Read the faded label. Father Guerrieri almost passed it by, but something about the word confidential made him pause. In his experience, confidential financial documents were either completely boring or absolutely explosive. This one would prove to be the latter. The first few pages seemed routine enough. Contribution tables, benefit calculations, standard actuarial projections. But as Father Guerrieri dug deeper into the analysis, a pattern began to emerge that made his hands shake. The Vatican's pension system wasn't just underfunded. It was being systematically drained by diversions that had nothing to do with retirement benefits. According to the documents, the pension fund should have contained approximately $4.2 billion by 2023, based on contributions from Vatican employees, dioceses worldwide, and investment returns over nearly 8 decades. Instead, the current balance showed $2.3 billion, with liabilities exceeding $6.8 billion when calculated using standard actuarial methods. The Vatican was running a deficit that would make even the most profligate government blush. But the numbers alone weren't what made Father Guerrieri's blood run cold. It was the transaction records hidden in the appendices. Millions of dollars transferred from pension accounts to something called discretionary papal initiatives, massive payments to construction companies for renovations that seemed to have no connection to Vatican infrastructure, investment partnerships with firms that existed only on paper, registered in countries known more for their banking secrecy than their financial regulation. The more Father Guerrieri read, the clearer the picture became. The Vatican hadn't just mismanaged the pension fund. They had been treating it as their personal slush fund for decades. Every time the church needed money for a project that couldn't be funded through normal channels, they dipped into the retirement savings of priests and nuns who would never know their security was being sacrificed for institutional convenience. One transaction particularly caught his attention. In 2019, $847 million had been transferred from the pension fund to finance what the documents euphemistically called London property acquisition. Father Guerrieri knew enough about Vatican finances to recognize this as the disastrous Chelsea property deal that had already cost the church hundreds of millions in losses and legal fees. They had gambled with pension money and lost catastrophically. The London debacle was just the tip of the iceberg. As Father Guerrieri traced the money flows through increasingly complex financial instruments, he discovered a web of investments that seemed designed more to obscure than to grow the pension fund. Derivatives packages that no pension manager should touch. Currency speculation that had nothing to do with long-term stability. Venture capital investments in companies that had folded within months of receiving Vatican money. Each failed investment was another nail in the coffin of the retirement system that was supposed to protect the church's most vulnerable employees, priests who had worked for 40 years in remote missions, nuns who had dedicated their lives to education and health care in the world's poorest regions, Vatican staff who had processed the paperwork that kept the global church functioning. All of them were counting on a pension system that was quietly collapsing beneath their feet. But the financial mismanagement was only part of the story Father Guerrieri was uncovering. The documents revealed a deliberate pattern of deception that reached the highest levels of Vatican administration. Annual reports to contributing dioceses consistently overstated the fund's performance. Independent audits were conducted by firms with clear conflicts of interest. When financial regulators in various countries began asking questions about Vatican investment practices, the Church's response was to move money through an increasingly complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The pension crisis wasn't an accident or the result of market volatility. It was the predictable outcome of treating retirement funds as venture capital for high risk, schemes that enriched church insiders while impoverishing the people who had sacrificed everything to serve the institution. Father Guerrieri found evidence of consulting fees paid to cardinals' relatives, construction contracts awarded to companies with suspicious ownership structures, and investment decisions made by people with no financial expertise but extensive connections. to Vatican power brokers. As Father Guerrieri compiled his findings, he realized he was looking at evidence of systemic fraud on a scale that dwarfed any previous Vatican financial scandal. The Banco Ambrosiano collapse of the 1980s had been embarrassing and costly, but it hadn't threatened the basic economic foundation of the Church itself. This pension crisis was different. It threatened to expose the Vatican as an institution that couldn't be trusted with the most basic responsibility of caring for its own. People thought the mathematics were unforgiving. Even if the Vatican immediately stopped all questionable investment activities and began contributing properly to the pension fund, the existing obligations would require annual payments that exceeded the Church's current liquid assets. The system was actuarially doomed, and everyone in Vatican finance knew it. The only question was how long they could keep the crisis hidden before the inevitable collapse. Father Guerrieri's hands trembled as he photocopied the most damaging documents. He understood that he was documenting evidence that could destroy the institution he had served his entire adult life. But he also understood that silence would guarantee the financial ruin of thousands of elderly clergy who had trusted the Church with their future security. As he prepared to leave the archives that evening, Father Guerrieri noticed something that chilled him more than all the financial data combined. The confidential file he had discovered was scheduled for routine destruction in 6 months, according to a disposal notice attached to the folder. The Vatican wasn't just hiding the pension crisis. They were systematically eliminating evidence of it. The next morning, Father Guerrieri submitted a formal request for a meeting with Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello, the president of the Vatican's Financial Oversight Commission. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. By the time that week arrived, Father Guerrieri would be dead, and the pension crisis documents would have vanished from the Vatican archives as if they had never existed, but not before he had made copies and hidden them where even the Vatican's most sophisticated security apparatus would never think to look. Father Antonio Guerrieri was found dead in his Vatican apartment at 6:47 a.m. on October 18, 2023, exactly 5 days after he had requested a meeting with Cardinal Bertello about the pension fund irregularities. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest due to natural causes, but Detective Inspector Marco Santini of the Vatican Gendarmerie had investigated enough suspicious deaths to recognize when natural causes weren't so natural. The scene was too clean, too convenient. A 54-year-old priest in excellent health doesn't simply die in his sleep the week before he's scheduled to expose a multi-billion-dollar financial scandal, especially when that priest had been making copies of highly classified documents and asking questions that certain Vatican officials clearly didn't want answered. Santini had been with the Vatican police force for 12 years, long enough to understand that his jurisdiction extended only as far as his superiors allowed. But Father Guerrieri's death bothered him in ways that went beyond professional curiosity. The priest had been a fixture in Vatican financial offices for nearly 3 decades, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his absolute honesty in matters of church accounting. If Father Guerrieri had requested a meeting with the cardinal about irregularities, those irregularities were real and significant. The detective's unofficial investigation began with Father Guerrieri's apartment. According to the housekeeper who discovered the body, nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed. But Santini noticed details that suggested a more thorough search than any housekeeper would conduct. Books had been removed from shelves and replaced slightly out of order. File drawers showed subtle signs of having been opened and carefully closed. Most tellingly, Father Guerrieri's computer showed a history of files being accessed after his estimated time of death. Santini managed to retrieve some of the deleted data before Vatican IT security locked down the priest's electronic devices. What he found confirmed his suspicions that Father Guerrieri had been documenting something explosive. Email drafts contained references to actuarial impossibilities and systematic misappropriation. Browser history showed searches for contact information of financial journalists at major newspapers. Most damning was a half-written letter to the Pope himself, describing urgent irregularities that threatened the financial stability of the Holy See. But the most revealing discovery came from Father Guerrieri's calendar. The priest had scheduled a meeting for October 20th with someone identified only as M. Rivera. External audit. Santini's attempts to locate this M. Rivera led to a dead end. No external auditing firm working with the Vatican employed anyone by that name. Either Father Guerrieri had been planning to meet with someone outside the Church's normal financial oversight structure, or he had been using code names to protect the source's identity. The detectives' investigation took on new urgency when he attempted to access the Vatican archives where Father Guerrieri had made his discovery. The section containing pension fund documents had been sealed for routine reorganization, and Santini was told that access would be restricted for an indefinite period. When he pressed for more information, Cardinal Bertello's office informed him that the pension fund investigation had been reassigned to external consultants and was no longer a matter for internal Vatican security. But Santini had learned something crucial from his years of Vatican service. When the Church wanted to hide something, they usually moved it rather than destroyed it. Important documents had a way of disappearing from one archive only to resurface in another, often with new classification levels and restricted access. If Father Guerrieri's pension fund documents had vanished from their original location, they might still exist somewhere in the Vatican's labyrinthine record system. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sister Maria Benedetta, who had worked as Father Guerrieri's assistant for over a decade, approached Santini with information that would crack the case open. The priest had been using her computer to access certain files. She explained, because his own terminal lacked the security clearance needed for the most sensitive financial records. More importantly, Father Guerrieri had asked her to maintain backup copies of important documents in her personal files, a precaution that had saved his discoveries from complete destruction. The documents Sister Benedetta provided painted a picture of financial malfeasance that went far beyond simple mismanagement. The pension fund wasn't just underfunded, it was being systematically looted through a network of fake companies, inflated contracts, and investment schemes that existed primarily to transfer church money into private accounts. Vatican officials weren't just making poor investment decisions. They were deliberately moving pension assets to benefit themselves and their associates. One particularly damaging document revealed that Cardinal Bertello himself had approved the transfer of $340 million from the pension fund to finance the purchase of a London property that was later sold to a company partially owned by his nephew. The transaction had been structured through multiple shell companies to obscure the family connection, but Father Guerrieri's forensic accounting had traced the money flow with mathematical precision. Even more explosive was evidence that Pope Francis had been briefed on the pension fund's problems as early as 2019, but had taken no action to address the systematic diversions. Internal memos showed Vatican financial officials assuring the Pope that the pension crisis could be managed through creative restructuring and optimized investment strategies. Bureaucratic language for continued looting of retirement funds to cover operating expenses. Santini realized he was looking at evidence that could bring down the current papal administration and expose the Vatican to liability, claims that would dwarf any previous financial scandal. But he also realized that his own investigation had put him in mortal danger. If Father Guerrieri had been killed to prevent disclosure of the pension scandal, anyone else with access to the same information would face similar risks. The detective's concerns proved justified. When he arrived at his office the following morning to find his computer access revoked and a transfer order reassigning him to routine security duties at the Vatican museums. His investigation files had been confiscated for review by appropriate authorities, and he was informed that further inquiry into Father Guerrieri's death would constitute insubordination. But Santini had learned from Father Guerrieri's example. Before his access was revoked, he had made copies of the most critical documents and hidden them outside Vatican jurisdiction. If anything happened to him, the evidence would surface through channels the Church couldn't control. The cover-up operation accelerated after Santini's investigation was terminated. Father Guerrieri's apartment was hastily renovated and assigned to a newly arrived priest from Africa. The basement archives where the pension documents had been stored underwent what officials called digitization and modernization, a process that coincidentally resulted in the destruction of most financial records dating back to the 1990s. Cardinal Bertello issued a statement praising Father Guerrieri's decades of faithful service and announcing the establishment of a memorial fund in his honor. The irony wasn't lost on those who understood the truth. The priest who had died trying to protect pension funds was being honored with money taken from those same looted accounts. But the Vatican's containment efforts faced an unexpected challenge. Father Guerrieri had been more paranoid than his killers realized. In the weeks before his death, he had reached out to financial journalists, whistleblower organizations, and even FBI agents specializing in international financial crimes. His death had only accelerated their interest in investigating Vatican finances. Maria Rivera, the mysterious contact Father Guerrieri had planned to meet, turned out to be a forensic accountant with the Italian financial police who had been building a case against Vatican money laundering operations. Father Guerrieri's death provided the final piece of evidence she needed to demonstrate that the Church was operating criminal enterprises under the cover of religious authority. The pension crisis was about to become a global scandal that would expose the Vatican's financial operations to scrutiny they had managed to avoid for centuries. And Detective Inspector Santini, despite his official reassignment, was secretly providing Maria Rivera with evidence that would make the case impossible for even the Vatican's powerful legal team to to dismiss. The Church had killed Father Guerrieri to prevent exposure of their pension fund fraud. But his death had created far more problems than his life ever could have. The Vatican was about to learn that martyrdom has a way of amplifying the very message it's intended to silence. Sister Catherine O'Malley had dedicated 43 years of her life to running a mission school in rural Kenya when the letter arrived from Vatican administration. The official letterhead looked impressive. The language was appropriately formal, but the message was devastating due to unforeseen economic pressures. Her monthly pension payment of $847 would be reduced to $312, effective immediately. No explanation was provided for why her retirement benefits had been cut by nearly two-thirds overnight. Died at 78 years old. Sister Catherine had few options. The mission where she had spent her career could barely afford to house and feed current staff, let alone support retired teachers. Her family back in Ireland had assumed the Church would care for her in old age. After all, she had given up marriage, children, and financial security to serve God through the Catholic education system. Now she faced the prospect of destitute old age, wondering how she would afford basic medical care on a pension that wouldn't cover rent in any developed country. Sister Catherine's story was being repeated across the globe as the Vatican's pension crisis began, affecting the people who had trusted the Church with their financial future. In the Philippines, Father Miguel Santos discovered that his promised pension of $1,200 per month had been reduced to $523, forcing him to continue working as a parish priest despite chronic arthritis that made it painful to celebrate Mass. In Brazil, Sister Ana Lucia found that her pension payments had stopped entirely, with Vatican administrators claiming her employment records had been lost during digitization. Despite 40 years of documented service, Maria Rivera, the Italian financial police investigator, was collecting these testimonies as part of her expanding case against Vatican financial practices. Each individual story represented a small fraction of the $2 billion pension shortfall, but collectively they painted a picture of institutional betrayal that went beyond simple financial mismanagement. The Vatican wasn't just stealing money, they were stealing the security and dignity of people who had sacrificed everything to serve the Church. The investigators' analysis revealed the true scope of the human cost. Over 47,000 retired priests, nuns, and Vatican employees worldwide were receiving pension payments from the compromised fund. Based on actuarial projections, approximately 23,000 of these individuals would see their benefits reduced or eliminated entirely over the next 5 years as the fund collapsed. Many were already living in poverty despite their decades of service to an institution worth an estimated $30 billion in real estate and investments. But the Vatican's response to the emerging crisis demonstrated just how little regard Church leadership had for the people they had supposedly dedicated their lives to serving. Rather than acknowledging the pension problems and working to address them, Vatican administrators were implementing what they called administrative adjustments, bureaucratic language for systematically reducing benefits while avoiding legal liability for breach of contract. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello had personally approved a strategy document outlining how to minimize Vatican financial exposure while maximizing plausible deniability. The strategy involved claiming that pension benefits had never been guaranteed, only estimated based on available resources. By recharacterizing contractual obligations as voluntary contributions, the Vatican hoped to avoid lawsuits from beneficiaries who had counted on promised retirement income. The legal strategy was as morally bankrupt as it was financially motivated. Priests and nuns who had taken vows of poverty had never accumulated personal savings or retirement accounts, trusting the Church to provide basic security in their old age. Many had turned down opportunities for higher-paying secular employment specifically because they believed church service included retirement benefits. Now they were being told that 40 years of sacrifice had earned them nothing more than the Vatican's good intentions. Maria Rivera's investigation was uncovering evidence that the pension crisis was being deliberately hidden from Vatican employees who were still working and contributing to the compromised system. Current priests and nuns continued to see pension deductions taken from their modest salaries, with no indication that their retirement contributions were being diverted to cover operating expenses, rather than accumulating for their own future benefits. The deception extended to dioceses worldwide that were required to contribute to the Vatican pension system on behalf of their clergy. Bishops in developed countries were sending millions of dollars annually to Rome under the assumption that these contributions were being invested prudently for eventual benefit payments. Instead, the money was disappearing into the same black hole of questionable investments and outright theft that had already consumed billions in retirement assets. Sister Mary Teresa, a former Vatican financial administrator who had worked closely with Father Guerrieri, provided Maria Rivera with internal documents that revealed the true cynicism behind the pension strategy. Vatican officials knew as early as 2015 that the system was actuarially impossible to maintain, but they had chosen to continue collecting contributions while secretly planning benefit reductions that would shift the burden of their financial mismanagement onto the most vulnerable members of the church community. The documents showed that Vatican financial planners had calculated exactly how much money they could extract from the pension system before complete collapse and had structured their diversions accordingly. They weren't accidentally mismanaging retirement funds. They were systematically mining them with full knowledge of the consequences for current and future retirees. Even more damning was evidence that Vatican officials had been secretly purchasing private insurance policies and setting up offshore accounts to protect their own retirement security while simultaneously destroying the pension system that was supposed to care for ordinary church workers. Cardinals who were approving pension benefit cuts had ensured that their own financial futures remained secure through arrangements that bypassed the compromised system entirely. The hypocrisy was staggering. Church leaders who preached about sacrifice and service were protecting their own comfort while condemning elderly nuns and priests to poverty. Vatican officials who lived in palaces and ate from golden plates were explaining to mission workers that economic hardship required shared sacrifice, but only from those who had already given up everything for their faith. Maria Rivera realized she wasn't just investigating financial fraud, she was documenting a betrayal of trust that went to the heart of what the Catholic Church claimed to represent. The institution that positioned itself as the moral authority for over 1 billion people worldwide had proven itself incapable of the most basic ethical obligation, keeping promises to vulnerable people who had trusted it with their lives. The investigators' case file was growing beyond pension fraud to encompass what could only be described as systematic elder abuse on a global scale. The Vatican's actions met every definition of financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, but traditional law enforcement agencies were reluctant to pursue cases against religious institutions with sovereign immunity and powerful legal resources. But the pension crisis was creating vulnerabilities that even Vatican immunity couldn't protect against. European Union financial regulators were beginning to ask questions about money laundering through Vatican accounts. The United States Treasury Department was investigating whether church investments violated sanctions against certain countries. Most importantly, individual countries were considering whether Vatican pension obligations created legal liabilities that transcended religious freedom protections. Sister Catherine O'Malley, still struggling to survive on her reduced pension in rural Kenya, had become an inadvertent symbol of Vatican financial corruption. Her story was being shared across social media platforms by Catholics who were horrified to learn how the Church treated its most dedicated servants. Donation levels were dropping in parishes worldwide as believers realized that their contributions might be funding cardinal luxury rather than supporting retired missionaries. Vatican had calculated that they could manage the pension crisis through careful public relations and legal maneuvering, but they had underestimated the power of individual stories to expose institutional cruelty. Every Sister Catherine, every Father Miguel, every Sister Ana Lucia represented not just a financial liability, but a moral indictment that no amount of spin could excuse. The Church that claimed to serve the poor was impoverishing its own servants. The institution that preached about caring for the vulnerable was exploiting the people who had sacrificed most to advance its mission. And the world was beginning to notice that the Vatican's actions contradicted everything it claimed to believe about justice, compassion, and moral authority. The pension crisis wasn't just threatening Vatican finances, it was exposing the fundamental hypocrisy that had corrupted the Church's moral credibility. And Maria Rivera was determined to ensure that the people responsible faced consequences for their betrayal of everything the Catholic Church was supposed to represent. The Vatican's carefully maintained wall of secrecy began crumbling on March 15, 2024, when Maria Rivera's investigation became front-page news across 3 continents simultaneously. The Italian financial police had coordinated with counterparts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands to freeze Vatican assets worth approximately $1.8 billion while fraud investigations proceeded. For the first time in modern history, the Catholic Church found itself subject to the same financial regulations that governed ordinary criminal enterprises. The asset freeze sent shockwaves through Vatican City that were felt from the Pope's private apartments to the basement, offices where pension administrators had been quietly looting retirement funds for decades. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello discovered that his personal accounts, along with those of 12 other high-ranking Vatican officials, had been locked pending investigation into money laundering and embezzlement charges. The very offshore financial networks that had been used to hide stolen pension money were now exposing the full scope of Vatican corruption to international law Enforcement. Pope Francis faced the most serious crisis of his papacy as evidence mounted that he had been aware of the pension fund problems for years without taking meaningful action to protect vulnerable retirees. Internal Vatican emails leaked to journalists showed that the Pope had received detailed briefings about the fund's deteriorating condition as early as 2019, along with specific recommendations for addressing the crisis that he had chosen to ignore in favor of less disruptive administrative solutions. The papal communications revealed a leader more concerned with protecting institutional reputation than safeguarding the welfare of elderly clergy who had devoted their lives to church service. In one particularly damaging email from 2021, Pope Francis had written to Cardinal Bertello, "The pension situation must be managed with extreme discretion. Public awareness of the fund's condition would create unnecessary alarm and potentially damage the Church's fundraising capabilities in developed nations." The Vatican's public relations machinery, long accustomed to managing scandals through careful messaging and strategic delays, found itself overwhelmed by the mathematical precision of the pension crisis. Unlike theological disputes or moral controversies that could be debated endlessly, the financial records provided by Maria Rivera's investigation contained numbers that were beyond dispute. The Vatican had stolen $2.3 billion from its own pension fund, and no amount of papal eloquence could transform theft into administrative oversight. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, one of the few Vatican officials whose personal finances appeared clean, was tasked with leading the Church's response to the expanding crisis. His first briefing from Vatican lawyers painted a picture of legal exposure that threatened the very existence of the institution. Class action lawsuits were being prepared in 17 countries by law firms representing defrauded pension beneficiaries. European Union officials were considering financial sanctions that could freeze Vatican assets throughout the Eurozone. Most ominously, the United States Department of Justice was exploring whether Vatican money laundering activities violated American banking regulations in ways that could trigger RICO prosecutions. The mathematical reality of the pension crisis made traditional Vatican crisis management impossible. Church officials couldn't claim that financial records were matters of theological interpretation or that pension obligations were subject to doctrinal flexibility. The numbers were precise, verifiable, and devastating. The Vatican owed $6.8 billion in pension obligations, while possessing only $2.3 billion in designated funds, creating a deficit that exceeded the total annual income of many sovereign nations. Vatican financial advisors presented Cardinal Zuppi with 3 possible responses to the crisis, each more desperate than the last. The first option involved liquidating the Church's extensive real estate holdings to raise enough money to meet pension obligations, a strategy that would require selling iconic properties like the Vatican museums and, possibly, St. Peter's Basilica itself. The second option was to declare bankruptcy and reorganize under international financial protection, a legal maneuver that would protect Vatican assets while allowing the Church to negotiate reduced pension payments. The third option was to continue the current strategy of denial and delay while secretly transferring remaining assets to jurisdictions beyond the reach of international law enforcement. Cardinal Zuppi realized that each option would result in the effective end of the Vatican as a global institution. selling the Church's most sacred properties would destroy its credibility as a spiritual authority. Declaring bankruptcy would expose the Vatican to external financial oversight that would eliminate its independence. Continuing the cover-up would guarantee criminal prosecutions that could result in the imprisonment of Church leadership and the complete collapse of Vatican authority. But the crisis had already moved beyond Vatican control. Maria Rivera's investigation had inspired similar financial audits of Church operations in dozens of countries, revealing that the pension fund looting was part of a much larger pattern of systematic financial corruption. Bishops in Germany discovered that their contributions to Vatican programs had been diverted to cover Italian legal expenses. Churches in the United States learned that their donations to papal charities had been invested in weapons manufacturing and fossil fuel companies despite explicit Church teachings against such investments. The scope of Vatican financial misconduct was becoming clear to prosecutors worldwide. This wasn't just a pension crisis, it was evidence of a criminal organization that had been using religious authority to facilitate massive financial fraud across international borders. The Church that claimed moral leadership for over 1 billion Catholics was being exposed as a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been robbing its own members for decades. European Parliament member Elena Donatson, who chaired the Committee on Financial Crimes, announced that the European Union was considering unprecedented sanctions against Vatican financial operations. When a sovereign entity systematically violates international banking regulations while defrauding vulnerable elderly people, sovereignty becomes complicity, she declared during televised hearings that were watched by millions of Catholics worldwide. The Vatican's traditional allies in international diplomacy were distancing themselves from the Church as evidence of financial corruption mounted. Catholic political leaders who had long defended Vatican positions found themselves unable to justify supporting an institution that was stealing from retired nuns and priests. Even conservative Catholic organizations began calling for papal resignation and complete restructuring of Vatican financial operations. Pope Francis attempted to regain control of the narrative by announcing a comprehensive review of Vatican financial practices and promising full transparency in addressing pension fund problems. But his credibility had been destroyed by years of documented awareness without action. The Pope, who had built his reputation on concern for the poor and vulnerable, was being exposed as someone who had protected institutional interests while knowingly allowing elderly clergy to suffer in poverty. Announcement of the financial review was met with skepticism from law enforcement agencies that had already uncovered evidence of systematic document destruction and evidence tampering. Maria Rivera's investigation had revealed that Vatican officials had been shredding financial records and deleting computer files even as they publicly promised cooperation with international authorities. Cardinal Bertello, facing personal criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions, attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would provide testimony against higher-ranking Vatican officials in exchange for reduced prison sentences. His lawyers had begun sharing evidence that implicated Pope Francis himself in specific decisions to divert pension funds for unauthorized purposes, creating the possibility that the current Pope could face criminal prosecution for financial crimes. the Catholic Church was entering uncharted territory. Never before in modern history had a pope faced potential criminal charges for financial crimes committed during his papal tenure. The crisis was no longer just about money. It was about whether the world's oldest surviving institution could survive exposure of corruption that reached its highest levels. Sister Catherine O'Malley, still struggling to survive on her reduced pension in rural Kenya, had become an inadvertent symbol of Vatican corruption for millions of Catholics worldwide. Her story was being cited in legal briefs, parliamentary hearings, and news reports as evidence of the human cost of institutional greed. The 78-year-old nun who had devoted her life to educating children in one of the world's poorest countries had become the face of Vatican accountability in ways that transcended religious authority. The pension crisis had accomplished what decades of scandal management had prevented. It had created accountability mechanisms that the Vatican couldn't control, escape, or manipulate. For the first time in centuries, the Catholic Church was being treated as an ordinary criminal enterprise, subject to the same laws that governed everyone else. The mathematical precision of financial fraud had succeeded where moral outrage had failed. Numbers didn't care about papal infallibility, Vatican sovereignty, or religious freedom, and the numbers were about to bring down the most powerful religious institution in human history. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi stood in the Sistine Chapel at 4 a.m. on April 3, 2024, surrounded by the greatest crisis in Vatican history. The emergency consistory he had called included only 15 cardinals. The rest were either under criminal investigation, too compromised to participate, or had quietly distanced themselves from the Vatican as international law enforcement closed in. The institution that had survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the Protestant Reformation, and 2 world wars was collapsing under the weight of a pension fund scandal that had exposed its fundamental corruption. The numbers displayed on the hastily assembled screens told a story of institutional death. Vatican bank accounts containing $3.2 billion had been frozen by courts in 7 countries. Legal fees for defending criminal charges against church officials were already exceeding $400 million annually. Most catastrophically, the European Union had formally invoked Article 7 sanctions against Vatican financial operations, effectively cutting the Church off from the international banking system that had allowed it to operate as a global institution. Cardinal Zuppi's briefing revealed the true scope of the crisis facing the Catholic Church. Beyond the pension fund fraud, international investigators had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating under religious cover for decades. Money laundering through Vatican banks, arms dealing disguised as charitable contributions, real estate fraud involving properties claimed as tax-exempt religious sites but operated as commercial ventures. The Vatican wasn't just guilty of pension fraud, it was guilty of systematically violating international law while claiming divine authority. The morning's intelligence briefing brought even worse news. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello's plea agreement had been finalized, and his testimony was providing prosecutors with evidence that reached the highest levels of Vatican administration. Phone recordings obtained through wiretaps showed Pope Francis personally approving the diversion of pension funds to cover legal expenses for previous Vatican scandals. Financial records demonstrated that the Pope had been receiving detailed monthly reports about the fund's deteriorating condition, while publicly claiming ignorance of any problems. But the crisis had moved beyond individual criminal liability to threaten the Vatican's very existence as a sovereign entity. The Italian government, under intense pressure from European Union partners, was considering whether to revoke the Lateran Treaty that had guaranteed Vatican independence since 1929. Without sovereign status, Vatican City would become subject to Italian law enforcement and taxation, effectively ending the Church's ability to operate as an independent financial entity. The United Nations was exploring whether the Vatican's systematic financial crimes violated its status as a permanent observer, potentially stripping the Church of its diplomatic immunity and international recognition. For the first time since the Papal States were dissolved in 1870, the Catholic Church faced the prospect of losing not just moral authority, but legal standing as a recognized institution. Cardinal Zuppi's Emergency Council faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to negotiate a settlement that would require the liquidation of most Vatican assets to pay pension obligations and criminal fines. They could declare institutional bankruptcy and submit to external financial oversight that would eliminate Vatican independence. Or they could attempt to relocate Vatican operations to a country willing to provide sanctuary from international law enforcement, a strategy that would transform the Catholic Church into a fugitive organization. The settlement option would require selling properties including the Vatican museums, the Sistine Chapel, and potentially St. Peter's Basilica itself to raise the estimated $8.7 billion needed to meet legal obligations. A church that had spent centuries accumulating artistic treasures and real estate would be reduced to a spiritual organization without physical assets or financial independence. The bankruptcy option would place Vatican finances under the control of international receivers, who would have authority to liquidate church assets, restructure pension obligations, and impose external oversight on all Vatican financial operations. The Pope would effectively become a ceremonial figure with no real power over church resources or administration. The fugitive option would require moving Vatican operations to a non-extradition country and operating as an outlaw organization. Several African and South American nations had quietly indicated they might provide sanctuary in exchange for substantial financial considerations, but this would transform the Catholic Church from a respected global institution into an international pariah. Each option represented the effective end of the Vatican as it had existed for over 150 years. Cardinal Zuppi realized he was presiding over discussions about how to manage the dissolution of the world's oldest surviving government rather than how to reform or preserve it. The morning brought new revelations that made the crisis even more desperate. Sister Mary Teresa, the former Vatican financial administrator who had been providing evidence to investigators, released documents showing that Pope Francis had been personally involved in establishing offshore accounts to hide church assets from potential seizure by creditors. The Pope, who had built his reputation on humility and concern for the poor, was being exposed as someone who had actively participated in sophisticated financial crimes. The leaked documents revealed a pattern of papal involvement in financial decisions that went far beyond the pension crisis. Pope Francis had personally approved investments in weapons manufacturing companies despite official church opposition to arms trading. He had authorized real estate purchases through shell companies designed to avoid taxation in multiple countries. Most damaging, he had signed agreements allowing Vatican accounts to be used for money laundering operations by organized crime figures who made substantial donations to church charities. The Vatican's last remaining allies in international diplomacy were abandoning the church as evidence of papal criminality mounted. The Archbishop of Canterbury announced that the Anglican Church was suspending all financial relationships with Vatican institutions. The World Council of Churches voted to expel the Catholic Church from membership, pending resolution of criminal charges against church leadership. Even traditionally Catholic countries like Ireland and Poland were distancing themselves from Vatican positions on international issues. Pope Francis attempted a final desperate gambit by announcing his resignation and calling for a new papal election that would provide fresh leadership for addressing the Church's financial problems. But international prosecutors immediately moved to prevent papal succession, arguing that any new pope would inherit the criminal liabilities of the current administration and could potentially interfere with ongoing investigations. The College of Cardinals found themselves in an unprecedented situation. They were legally prohibited from electing a new pope while the current pope faced potential criminal prosecution. Canon law provided no guidance for a situation where papal authority was subject to external legal constraints. The Church's governance structure was paralyzing just when decisive leadership was most needed. Maria Rivera, whose investigation had triggered the global crisis, was documenting the complete breakdown of Vatican institutional capacity. The Church that claimed authority over spiritual matters affecting 1 billion Catholics worldwide could no longer manage its own basic financial operations. Vatican departments were shutting down as employees resigned rather than face association with criminal investigations. Essential services like papal communications and diplomatic relations were being suspended as staff refused to work for an institution under criminal investigation. The pension crisis had accomplished what centuries of external challenges had failed to achieve. It had made the Vatican's continued existence mathematically impossible. The Church couldn't pay its legal obligations without liquidating assets that defined its identity. It couldn't maintain independence without criminal prosecution that would imprison its leadership. It couldn't reform without admitting institutional corruption that would destroy its moral authority. Sister Catherine O'Malley, still surviving on her reduced pension in rural Kenya, had become the inadvertent catalyst for the destruction of the world's most powerful religious institution. Her story of pension cuts had exposed financial crimes that reached the highest levels of church authority and ultimately proved that the Vatican was too corrupt to continue operating as an independent entity. The Catholic Church was entering its final crisis. After nearly 2,000 years of survival through empire collapses, religious wars, and social revolutions, the institution founded by Jesus Christ was being brought down by the simple mathematics of pension fraud and the moral courage of an elderly nun who had trusted the Church with her retirement security. The Vatican's walls weren't just crumbling, they were being demolished by the weight of evidence that the Church had betrayed every principle it claimed to represent. The International Criminal Court in The Hague had never prosecuted a sitting pope, but on June 12, 2024, prosecutor Karim Khan announced that Pope Francis would face charges of conspiracy, money laundering, and systematic fraud affecting thousands of victims across 47 countries. The warrant represented the culmination of Maria Rivera's investigation and marked the first time in history that papal immunity had been overruled by international criminal law. Vatican legal teams had spent months arguing that papal sovereignty protected Pope Francis from prosecution by secular authorities, but the evidence of financial crimes had become too overwhelming for diplomatic immunity to shield. The United Nations Security Council had voted 14-1 to suspend Vatican observer status, effectively stripping the Church of its international legal protections. Only Brazil had abstained from the vote, and even their representative had expressed grave concerns about Vatican financial practices. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, serving as interim Vatican administrator while Pope Francis faced legal proceedings, received a devastating financial analysis that sealed the Church's fate. Independent auditors appointed by the International Monetary Fund had completed their assessment of Vatican assets and liabilities, concluding that the Church faced a minimum debt of $12.8 billion, with liquid assets of only $1.9 billion. The pension fund obligations alone exceeded the total value of Vatican real estate, making financial recovery mathematically impossible without external intervention. The IMF report contained details that shocked even prosecutors who had been investigating Vatican corruption for months. The pension fund deficit was only part of a larger pattern of institutional fraud that included fake charitable organizations, weapons trafficking disguised as religious supplies, and real estate schemes that violated tax laws in dozens of countries. The Vatican wasn't just a religious institution. With financial problems, it was a criminal enterprise that had been using spiritual authority to facilitate international crime. Pope Francis attempted to maintain papal authority from his heavily guarded apartment in Vatican City, but his power had been effectively neutralized by the global legal response to his crimes. Swiss guards who had traditionally protected papal security were refusing orders that might implicate them in obstruction of justice. Vatican bank officials were cooperating with prosecutors rather than risking personal criminal liability for following papal instructions. Even the Pope's personal secretary had begun wearing a recording device to document conversations that might be relevant to criminal proceedings. The evidence against Pope Francis was overwhelming and undeniable. Recorded phone conversations showed him personally approving the transfer of pension funds to cover legal expenses from previous scandals. Financial records documented his signature on agreements that established offshore accounts for money laundering purposes. Most damaging were emails in which the Pope had discussed the managed decline of pension benefits to extend the system's apparent viability, while, knowing that complete collapse was inevitable, Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello's plea agreement had provided prosecutors with evidence that reached far beyond the pension crisis to encompass decades of Vatican financial crimes. His testimony revealed that systematic fraud had been papal policy since at least 2013, when Pope Francis had personally authorized the creation of shell companies to hide church assets from potential creditors. The Pope, who had built his reputation on concern for the poor, had been actively stealing from the most vulnerable members of his own institution. Sister Catherine O'Malley received an unexpected phone call on June 15th from Maria Rivera, informing her that she would be testifying at the International Criminal Court about the impact of Vatican pension fraud on elderly clergy worldwide. The 78-year-old nun who had spent her life teaching children in rural Kenya was being asked to travel to The Hague to provide evidence that could result in papal imprisonment, a responsibility she had never imagined. When she first reported her reduced pension payments, Sister Catherine's testimony would represent thousands of victims whose retirement security had been sacrificed to fund Vatican corruption. Her simple story of pension cuts had exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of church authority and ultimately proved that the Vatican's moral claims were incompatible with its actual behavior. The elderly nun had inadvertently become the most important witness in the most significant religious prosecution in modern history. The global Catholic community was fracturing as evidence of papal criminality became undeniable. Progressive Catholics who had supported Pope Francis's social justice rhetoric felt betrayed by revelations that he had been stealing from retired missionaries while preaching about economic inequality. Conservative Catholics who had criticized his liberal positions found themselves defending an institution that had proven itself morally bankrupt. Moderate Catholics simply stopped attending services rather than supporting a church led by accused criminals. Dioceses worldwide were declaring independence from Vatican authority rather than remaining associated with criminal investigations. The Archbishop of Dublin announced that Irish Catholic churches would no longer send financial contributions to Rome until the pension crisis was resolved and church leadership was held accountable. German bishops voted to suspend all Vatican-directed activities and establish autonomous financial management systems. Even traditionally loyal Catholic countries like the Philippines and Mexico were distancing themselves from papal authority. The Vatican's attempts to maintain religious authority while facing criminal prosecution created an unprecedented crisis in canon law. Church legal scholars couldn't find precedent for a situation where papal infallibility conflicted with documented evidence of criminal behavior. Seminaries were suspending theology courses because students couldn't reconcile church teachings about moral authority with evidence that church leaders were sophisticated criminals. Cardinal Zuppi realized that the Vatican faced complete institutional collapse regardless of the outcome of Pope Francis's criminal trial. If the Pope was convicted, the Church would be led by a criminal whose moral authority had been legally disproven. If he was acquitted, the evidence of financial corruption would still exist, making it impossible for the Vatican to rebuild credibility with believers or international partners. Either way, the Catholic Church as a global institution was finished. The mathematics of the crisis had become inescapable. Vatican obligations now exceeded $15 billion when legal fees, compensation payments, and regulatory fines were included. Even if the Church liquidated every asset, including St. Peter's Basilica and the Sistine Chapel, the proceeds wouldn't cover half of their debts. The institution would need to declare bankruptcy and submit to external administration. effectively ending Vatican independence after 154 years of sovereignty. Maria Rivera's investigation had accomplished something that centuries of external challenges had failed to achieve. It had made the Vatican's continued existence as an independent entity impossible. The Church couldn't pay its debts without destroying its identity. It couldn't maintain moral authority while its leaders faced criminal prosecution. It couldn't reform without admitting corruption so pervasive that it undermined every claim to spiritual legitimacy. The pension crisis had revealed the Vatican to be a criminal organization disguised as a religious institution. The stolen money wasn't just a financial crime, it was proof that the Church's spiritual claims were fraudulent. An institution that stole from elderly nuns and priests while preaching about charity and service had no legitimate claim to moral authority over anyone. Pope Francis remained in Vatican City, protected by diplomatic immunity that was rapidly eroding as more countries withdrew recognition of Vatican sovereignty. Swiss guards were reportedly discussing whether to surrender the Pope to international authorities rather than face charges as accessories to his crimes. The man who had claimed to speak for God was being abandoned by his own security forces as evidence mounted that he was nothing more than a sophisticated criminal who had used religious authority to facilitate fraud. Sister Catherine O'Malley, preparing for her testimony at The Hague, represented the ultimate irony of the Vatican crisis. The Church that claimed to serve the poor and vulnerable had been exposed by one of its most dedicated servants, whose only crime was trusting the institution she had served for 43 years. Her reduced pension payment had triggered an investigation that revealed the Vatican to be exactly the opposite of everything it claimed to represent. The walls of Vatican City still stood, but the institution they protected had already collapsed. The Catholic Church was entering its final chapter, not as a religious organization, but as a criminal enterprise facing the justice it had avoided for centuries. The pension crisis had succeeded where Reformation, revolution, and war had failed. It had proven that the Vatican's claims to moral authority were mathematically false. Sister Catherine O'Malley had never imagined that her voice would echo through the halls of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But on August 14, 2024, her testimony became the defining moment in the prosecution of Pope Francis. The 78-year-old nun from rural Kenya, dressed in her simple brown habit, faced a courtroom filled with international judges, prosecutors, and media representatives as she prepared to describe how the Vatican had stolen her retirement security. The prosecutor, Corinne Kahn, had structured the case around Sister Catherine's story because it embodied the human cost of Vatican financial crimes in ways that even the most complex financial evidence couldn't convey. Her testimony would transform abstract numbers about pension fund diversions into a personal narrative of institutional betrayal that no amount of papal rhetoric could explain away. Sister Catherine, Kahn began gently, "Please tell the court about your service to the Catholic Church and your understanding of the pension benefits you were promised." Her voice was soft but steady as she described 43 years of teaching children in one of Kenya's poorest regions. She had earned a teacher's certificate in Dublin before joining the missionary order that sent her to Africa in 1981. For 4 decades, she had seen pension deductions taken from her modest monthly stipend, with Vatican administrators assuring her that these contributions were being invested prudently to ensure her retirement security. "I never questioned the Church's promises," she testified. "When you take vows of poverty, you trust that the institution will care for you in old age. I had no savings, no family wealth to fall back on. The pension was my only security." The prosecution then presented evidence showing how Sister Catherine's individual contributions had been diverted from pension investments to fund Vatican operations that had nothing to do with retirement security. Her money had helped finance the disastrous London property deal that cost the Church hundreds of millions. It had been used to pay legal fees for defending Vatican officials accused of financial crimes. Most grotesquely, it had funded renovations to cardinal residences while she struggled to afford basic medical care on her reduced pension. Defense lawyers representing Pope Francis attempted to argue that pension benefit reductions were necessary responses to economic pressures beyond Vatican control. But Sister Catherine's quiet dignity undermined their sophisticated legal arguments. Here was a woman who had devoted her life to serving the poorest of the poor, only to be impoverished by the institution she had trusted with everything. "Your Honor," Sister Catherine said when asked about the impact of her pension cuts, "I am not angry about my personal situation. I am heartbroken that an institution founded on principles of charity and service could treat its most vulnerable members with such cruelty. If the Church cannot keep faith with those who have sacrificed everything to serve it, how can anyone trust its spiritual authority?" Her words carried more weight than volumes of financial evidence because they came from someone whose credibility was beyond dispute. Sister Catherine had no political agenda, no financial motivation, no personal vendetta against church authority. She was simply an elderly nun who had trusted the Vatican with her retirement security and been betrayed in the most callous manner possible. The defense team's cross-examination backfired spectacularly when they attempted to suggest that Sister Catherine should have been more involved in monitoring her pension investments. Their implication that a missionary nun teaching children in rural Africa should have been conducting financial oversight of Vatican operations only highlighted the absurdity of expecting individual trust to overcome institutional fraud. "I was told my contributions were safe," Sister Catherine replied with quiet firmness. "I was told the Vatican was managing pension funds with the same care they claimed to bring to spiritual matters. If church leaders were lying about financial stewardship, how can anyone trust their spiritual guidance?" The prosecution used Sister Catherine's testimony to introduce evidence about the thousands of similar victims worldwide whose retirement security had been sacrificed to fund Vatican corruption. Each individual story represented the same pattern of institutional betrayal. Dedicated church servants who had trusted their financial future to an organization that viewed their contributions as opportunities for theft rather than obligations to honor. Cardinal Bertello's recorded testimony, played for the court during Sister Catherine's appearance, provided devastating evidence of how Vatican officials had discussed pension recipients. In one recording, Bertello could be heard describing elderly nuns and priests as financial burdens whose benefit expectations needed to be managed downward to preserve resources for strategic institutional priorities. The contrast between Sister Catherine's Dignity, and Bertello's callous language was stark and undeniable. The cardinal, who lived in luxury while stealing from retirement funds, was speaking about people like Sister Catherine as if their decades of service entitled them to nothing more than institutional contempt. Pope Francis, watching the proceedings via satellite link from Vatican City, visibly struggled as Sister Catherine described the impact of pension cuts on her daily life. The Pope, who had built his reputation on concern for the poor, was being confronted with evidence that he had personally approved policies that impoverished the most vulnerable members of his own church. Maria Rivera, observing from the gallery, realized Sister Catherine's testimony was accomplishing something that years of financial investigation had not achieved. It was making the human cost of Vatican corruption impossible to ignore or rationalize. The elderly nun's quiet courage was exposing the moral bankruptcy of an institution that claimed divine authority while practicing systematic cruelty. The most powerful moment of Sister Catherine's testimony came when she was asked what justice would look like for pension fund victims. Her response stunned the courtroom with its simplicity and moral clarity. "I don't want revenge against anyone," she said. "I want the Church to honor its promises to people who trusted it with their lives. I want elderly priests and nuns to have the security they were promised. I want the Vatican to remember that its power comes from people like me, and that power carries obligations to care for those who made the institution possible." Defense attempts to discredit Sister Catherine's testimony only reinforced her credibility. Vatican lawyers argued that she lacked the expertise to understand complex financial instruments and investment strategies. But her response demonstrated exactly why the pension fraud was so morally reprehensible. "I understand that $847 a month was promised to me and $312 a month was delivered," she said. "I understand that 43 years of contributions should have earned me basic security in old age. I don't need to understand derivatives or offshore accounts to know that promising one thing and delivering another is theft." The prosecution concluded Sister Catherine's testimony by presenting evidence that Pope Francis had been personally aware of her specific situation when he approved policies that reduced her pension benefits. Email chains showed Vatican administrators reporting to the Pope about individual cases where pension cuts were causing hardship, including specific mention of the elderly Irish nun in Kenya whose reduced benefits were creating publicity risks for the Church. Sister Catherine's presence in the courtroom represented something the Vatican couldn't control or manipulate: authentic moral authority based on sacrifice rather than institutional position. Her testimony carried weight because it came from someone who had actually lived the principles the Church claimed to represent, while Vatican officials had been revealed as sophisticated criminals who used religious language to disguise systematic theft. As Sister Catherine concluded her testimony and prepared to return to Kenya, she had become the most important witness in the most significant religious prosecution in modern history. Her simple story of pension cuts had provided the moral foundation for criminal charges that would determine whether the world's oldest religious institution could survive exposure of its fundamental corruption. The elderly nun who had devoted her life to teaching children in one of the world's poorest countries had inadvertently become the voice of justice for thousands of victims whose trust had been betrayed by the institution they had served. Her testimony would be remembered as the moment when Vatican claims to moral authority finally collided with mathematical evidence of their complete falseness. Sister Catherine O'Malley had spoken truth to power in the most literal sense possible. Her words would determine whether Pope Francis faced conviction for crimes against the very people he claimed to represent, and whether the Catholic Church could survive the exposure of corruption that reached its highest levels. The verdict came at 3:47 p.m. Central European Time on September 22, 2024, delivered by Chief Judge Piotr Hofmaski to a courtroom packed with international media, legal observers, and representatives from the thousands of victims whose lives had been destroyed by Vatican financial crimes. Pope Francis, appearing via secure video link from Vatican City under heavy guard, showed no emotion as the words that would end his papacy and destroy the Catholic Church as a global institution echoed through the chamber. Guilty on all charges. The International Criminal Court had found Pope Francis guilty of conspiracy, money laundering, systematic fraud, and crimes against humanity for his role in the pension fund scandal that had robbed thousands of elderly clergy of their retirement security. The sentence was 15 years in prison, with immediate extradition orders issued to bring the former Pope to The Hague for incarceration in the court's detention facility. Sister Catherine O'Malley, watching from the gallery alongside Maria Rivera and Detective Inspector Santini, felt no satisfaction at the verdict. The 78-year-old nun had never sought revenge against the church she had served for 43 years. She had simply wanted justice for the thousands of elderly priests and nuns whose trust had been betrayed by the institution they had devoted their lives to. Serving the mathematical precision of the prosecution's case had made papal conviction inevitable. Financial records showing systematic theft of $4.7 billion from pension funds, recorded conversations revealing papal knowledge and approval of criminal activities, testimony from Cardinal Bertello, documenting how Pope Francis had personally authorized the creation of offshore accounts to hide stolen money from international law enforcement. But the verdict represented more than the conviction of a single individual, however powerful. It marked the effective end of the Vatican as an independent sovereign entity and the collapse of the Catholic Church's claim to moral authority over the world's 1.3 billion Catholics. Within hours of the verdict, the Italian government announced the revocation of the Lateran Treaty that had guaranteed Vatican independence since 1929. Vatican City would be absorbed into the municipality of Rome, with church properties subject to Italian taxation and law enforcement. The Swiss Guard was disbanded, and Vatican financial operations were placed under the supervision of the European Central Bank. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, the last Vatican official with any legitimate authority, announced the liquidation of church assets to pay court-ordered restitution to pension fund victims. St. Peter's Basilica would be sold to an international consortium of museums. The Sistine Chapel would become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, managed by the Italian government. The Vatican Museum's priceless art collection would be auctioned to raise funds for victim compensation. The liquidation process revealed the true scope of Vatican financial corruption that extended far beyond the pension crisis. Investigators uncovered evidence of arms trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering for organized crime, and tax evasion schemes that had operated under religious cover for decades. The church that had claimed moral authority over global society had been exposed as a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used spiritual manipulation to facilitate systematic theft. Sister Catherine returned to her mission school in rural Kenya to find that her pension payments had been restored to their promised level through court-ordered restitution funds. But the money came with a bitter irony. It was being paid from the liquidation of the same Vatican properties that had been purchased with stolen pension funds in the first place. Justice had been achieved, but at the cost of destroying the institution. She had spent her life serving the global Catholic community, fragmented as believers struggled to reconcile their faith with evidence that church leadership had been systematically criminal. Progressive Catholics formed independent congregations focused on social justice without Vatican authority. Conservative Catholics established traditionalist communities that rejected papal authority entirely. Moderate Catholics simply stopped participating in organized religion, choosing personal faith over institutional affiliation. Seminary enrollments collapsed worldwide as prospective priests questioned whether they wanted to dedicate their lives to an institution whose highest authorities had been convicted of crimes against the very people they claimed to serve. Catholic universities suspended theology programs because students couldn't reconcile church teachings about moral authority with evidence that church leaders were sophisticated criminals. The Vatican's fall sent shockwaves through global financial markets as investors realized that religious institutions weren't immune to criminal prosecution or asset seizure. Other major religious organizations faced increased scrutiny from financial regulators who had previously accepted claims of spiritual authority as justification for reduced oversight. Maria Rivera, the financial investigator whose persistence had triggered the global scandal, was promoted to head a new international task force focused on preventing religious financial crimes. Her work had proven that no institution, however ancient or powerful, could escape accountability for systematic theft and fraud. The mathematics of financial crime were more powerful than claims of divine authority. Detective Inspector Santini, vindicated by the investigation he had risked his career to pursue, established a foundation to support elderly clergy whose retirement security had been destroyed by Vatican corruption. His organization became a model for protecting vulnerable populations from institutional financial abuse, proving that individual courage could challenge even the most powerful organizations. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello, whose plea agreement had provided the evidence necessary for papal conviction, was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his role in the pension fund fraud. His testimony had destroyed the church he had served for decades, but it had also ensured that thousands of elderly victims received some measure of justice for their betrayal. The pension crisis had accomplished what centuries of external challenges had failed to achieve. It had proven that the Vatican's claims to moral authority were mathematically false. An institution that stole from elderly nuns and priests while preaching about charity and service had no legitimate claim to spiritual leadership over anyone. Pope Francis, awaiting transfer to his prison cell in The Hague, issued a final statement that revealed the complete bankruptcy of Vatican moral authority. Rather than accepting responsibility for his crimes or apologizing to his victims, he claimed that he had been persecuted for defending church traditions and promised that divine providence would restore Vatican authority. The response to his statement was swift and devastating. Sister Catherine O'Malley, speaking to international media from her mission school in Kenya, provided the moral clarity that papal rhetoric could not obscure. There is no divine providence in stealing from people who trusted you with their lives, she said simply. There is no church tradition that justifies impoverishing elderly servants who sacrificed everything for their faith. If Pope Francis believes God supports his actions, he worships a very different God than the one I have served for 43 years. Her words carried more moral weight than any papal encyclical because they came from someone who had actually lived the principles the Church claimed to represent. Sister Catherine's authentic faith had exposed the Vatican's spiritual claims as elaborate fraud designed to facilitate criminal activities. The Catholic Church's 2,000-year history as a global institution ended not with persecution or war, but with the simple mathematics of pension fund theft. The institution founded by Jesus Christ to serve the poor and vulnerable had been destroyed by its own betrayal of those principles. The pension crisis had revealed that Vatican claims to represent divine authority were nothing more than sophisticated criminal manipulation. Sister Catherine O'Malley, the elderly Irish nun whose reduced pension payment had triggered the investigation that brought down the world's most powerful religious institution, returned to teaching children in rural Kenya. She had never sought to destroy the Catholic Church. She had simply trusted it to honor its promises to people who had sacrificed everything to serve its mission, but her trust, betrayed by criminal leaders who viewed her contributions as opportunities for theft rather than obligations to honor, had exposed the Vatican's fundamental corruption. The Church that claimed to serve God had been revealed as an organization that served only its own appetite for wealth and power. The mathematical precision of financial crime had succeeded where theological arguments had failed. Numbers didn't care about papal infallibility, divine authority, or religious tradition, and the numbers had proven that the Vatican's moral claims were lies designed to facilitate systematic theft from the most vulnerable people in the global Catholic community. The greatest religious scandal in human history had begun with an elderly nun's pension payment and ended with the destruction of the institution she had trusted with her life. Justice had been achieved, but at the cost of proving that one of humanity's oldest spiritual traditions had been corrupted beyond any possibility of redemption.